He didn't even finish his sentence. One moment Pastor Bob Joyce was speaking calmly, answering a simple question about faith, and the next his words just stopped, cut clean in the middle, as if something inside him slammed into a wall he didn't see coming. The visitor sitting across from him noticed the shift instantly. Bob's hand froze above the desk, his breathing quieted, and his eyes locked onto a small photograph that had slipped out of a folder. It wasn't a new picture, not a recent snapshot, not even something unusual. It was an old black-and-white image of Elvis Presley in his 30s, the kind of photo fans had seen 1,000 times. But something about this one, this expression, this era, this exact captured second, pulled every trace of air out of the room. Bob didn't blink. He didn't move. For a long moment, he didn't even breathe. It was as if the photo had reached backward through time and touched a part of him he'd spent years trying to keep quiet. The visitor cleared his throat softly, unsure of what he'd accidentally triggered. "Pastor, are you all right?" But Bob didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the picture, like he was seeing something no one else could, or maybe remembering something he had never allowed himself to. Only when he finally inhaled, a shaky, uneven breath, did the visitor realize this wasn't simple surprise. This was recognition. The kind that runs deeper than memory, the kind that reaches into old wounds. Bob reached out slowly, almost reluctantly, as if touching the photo might open a door he wasn't sure he wanted open. His fingers hovered above Elvis's face, trembling slightly, and he whispered something under his breath, too soft for the visitor to fully catch. It sounded like, "Not again." Just 2 words, but they carried weight, heavy, buried weight. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker in his eyes, something raw, something old, something that didn't belong to a man who had spent decades cultivating peace. Where did you get that?" he asked. The visitor blinked, confused by the intensity. "Oh, at a flea market last month. The seller said it was from a private collection. I brought it because, well, people say you look like him." Bob closed his eyes for a second, pained by that comment in a way the visitor couldn't understand. He had learned to smile politely whenever people brought it up, to laugh it off with a gentle joke about coincidence, genetics, or how faces in the South tend to resemble someone famous if you squint long enough. But today, he didn't laugh. He didn't even pretend to. He just looked back at the photograph as if it had said something he couldn't ignore. After a long moment, he murmured, "People don't bring pictures like this unless they're searching for something." The visitor frowned, searching for what? That was when Bob's voice cracked, just slightly, but enough to reveal the truth. Whatever he saw in that picture wasn't about resemblance at all. He whispered, "Answers." The visitor tried to lighten the mood. "Well, I wasn't trying to start anything, I just thought you might enjoy." But Bob interrupted softly, "No, you didn't know you couldn't." Silence settled between them, thick, weighted, unsettling. Bob finally lifted the photograph, holding it gently, almost respectfully, as though he were afraid it might crumble in his hands. His eyes drifted across Elvis's face, lingering on the eyes, the expression, the shadow behind the smile. He swallowed hard. "You ever look at a picture," he said quietly, "and feel like it's looking right back into you?" The visitor hesitated. "Sometimes, I guess." Bob shook his head slightly. "No, not like this, not with him." The visitor tilted his head. "You mean Elvis?" Another long pause. Then Bob said something unexpected, something that didn't sound like admiration or fandom or casual observation. "He looks tired." The visitor blinked. "Tired? Pastor, that's one of his best pictures. People say it shows him at his peak." "That's why it hurts," Bob replied softly, "because people think peak means peace." The visitor didn't know how to respond, and Bob didn't seem to expect him to. His gaze remained locked on the photograph, and the stillness in his posture revealed that this wasn't just nostalgia. It was something closer to grief. He whispered almost to himself, "I remember that look." The visitor's eyebrows lifted. "Remember, You mean from seeing his concerts?" Bob didn't answer. His silence said more than any explanation could. Something in the room shifted, a tension the visitor couldn't describe but couldn't deny. Bob gently set the picture back on the desk, but his eyes stayed fixed on it as if the image had anchored him to a moment he had spent years trying to forget. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and when he spoke again, his voice had that calm pastoral tone people recognized, but thinner, more fragile. "You know," he said, "people think they understand what this man carried. They think they know his weight because they know his fame, but fame isn't weight, attention isn't burden, the real heaviness that came from somewhere deeper." The visitor leaned forward slightly. "Deeper how?" Bob hesitated, then spoke with a softness that sounded almost reverent. "I've seen eyes like that before, eyes that laugh in public but plead in private." The visitor felt a small chill crawl up his arms, though he couldn't say why. Bob lifted the picture again, studying it with almost surgical precision. He wasn't admiring it. He wasn't comparing himself to it. He was searching inside it. And then he said something the visitor never forgot. People forget the man beneath the music. They forget the soul behind the voice. Another micropause, another flicker of something in his eyes, pain, maybe, or recognition. "Some of us can't forget," he added quietly. The visitor tilted his head. "You talk about him like you knew him." Bob's breath stalled just for a fraction of a second. I knew what he was searching for. Which was peace. The simplicity of the word made the room feel smaller. He ran a thumb gently along the edge of the photo, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "There's a reason this picture hit me harder than the others." The visitor waited, sensing something important. Bob took another breath, slow, deliberate, waited. "He wasn't posing in this one," he murmured. "He was thinking." "Thinking about what?" the visitor asked. Bob's eyes softened with something like sorrow. "You ever look at someone who's pretending to be strong," he said, "and know, not guess, know that they're collapsing inside?" The visitor nodded carefully. "Sure, I've seen that." Bob shook his head gently. "Not like this." Silence again. Then, as if pulled by memory, he continued in a softer, more fragile tone. "There was a night, a long time ago, when I saw Elvis look just like this. Same heaviness, same fear, same searching." The visitor leaned in. "You saw him like that?" Bob's silence answered the question. He wasn't talking as a fan. He wasn't talking as a distant observer. He was talking as someone who had once stood close enough to see the man behind the myth. He didn't elaborate, not yet. He simply let the tension hang there, heavy and deliberate, an emotional open loop designed by life itself. The visitor swallowed. "Pastor, what do you mean you saw him like that? Where?" Bob didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked his own. "You know what breaks a man the most?" The visitor shook his head. "It's not failure," Bob said. "It's not heartbreak. It's not exhaustion. It's silence. The silence between who you are and who the world thinks you're supposed to be." He tapped the photo lightly. "That silence is in his eyes here." The visitor studied the picture again, trying to see what Bob saw, but to him, it still looked like a confident, charismatic Elvis in his prime. Bob continued, voice trembling slightly. "People think pictures freeze a moment, but sometimes they freeze a warning." "What warning?" the visitor asked. "That even the strongest souls can drown quietly." Bob's gaze lingered on the photo longer this time, absorbing something unsaid, something invisible to anyone but him. He whispered he was already slipping when this was taken, not because of the fame or the pressure, but because he couldn't find what his heart needed. "And what was that?" the visitor asked. Another pause. "Grace," Bob whispered. The visitor shivered without knowing why. Bob sighed, rubbing his forehead, suddenly looking older than he had moments earlier. "I've spent years preaching about healing, about forgiveness, about salvation, but this picture reminds me that some souls needed those things long before the world realized it. He finally set the photo down, but not with detachment, more like someone gently releasing something sacred. The visitor hesitated, then asked the question hanging in the air. "Pastor, why did that one picture affect you so much?" Bob lifted his eyes slowly, and the answer he gave was the first thread that would unravel everything he held inside. "Because," he said, "it's the same look he gave me the night he asked me a question I never answered." The visitor froze. "What question?" Bob's voice lowered to almost a whisper. "A question that still keeps me awake sometimes." The visitor leaned forward, heartbeat quickening. "Pastor, what did he ask you?" Bob exhaled slowly, the memory clearly heavier than he expected. "I'll tell you," he said, "but you need to understand something first." He paused, locking eyes with the visitor, his voice dropping deeper, softer, more vulnerable. "When a man carries that much pain, he doesn't show it to just anyone." The visitor swallowed hard. "So why did he show it to you?" Bob looked back at the photograph as if it held the answer. And in the quietest voice the visitor had ever heard from him, Bob said, "Because in that moment, he wasn't Elvis Presley." Another pause. He was just a man trying to find God. The room fell into silence. Heavy, unanswered, unfinished. Exactly the way Bob needed it to linger before the truth came next. For several long seconds after he spoke, Pastor Bob didn't move. The visitor waited, unsure whether he should ask more or let the silence guide the moment. But Bob didn't need prompting. He kept staring at the photograph, as if Elvis's eyes were asking questions he still didn't have answers to, even after all these years. When he finally shifted his gaze, it wasn't toward the visitor. It was inward, toward something he'd buried long ago. "You asked why this picture hit me so hard," he said softly, "but it's not the picture, it's the memory it woke up." The visitor leaned slightly forward, drawn in by the gravity in his tone. Bob didn't look up. He ran his thumb along the bottom edge of the photo, the way someone touches the corner of a long-forgotten letter. "There was a night," he said, "when I saw him carrying something he didn't know how to speak out loud, and I didn't know how to help him. I didn't understand the weight he was drowning under, not until it was too late." The visitor swallowed hard. "You really knew him, didn't you?" Bob exhaled slowly. "Not in the way people imagine, not backstage, not in the spotlight, not in the fan stories or the Hollywood versions. The time I'm talking about, it wasn't a performance. It wasn't fame. It was a moment between a man and a boy who didn't yet know he'd become a pastor." The visitor blinked. "A boy." Bob nodded. "I wasn't a pastor then. I wasn't even close. I was just someone who happened to be near him at the right time, or maybe the wrong time, depending on how you look at it." He sank back slightly in his chair, shoulders tightening, not from discomfort, but from the weight of memory pressing down. "People forget Elvis was human," he continued quietly. "They forget he struggled. They forget he doubted. They forget he had nights when he begged God for answers that never came." The visitor listened in silence, sensing that this part of the story wasn't something Bob had shared with many people, if he had ever shared it at all. Bob's voice dropped again. "I was 16 when I first saw that look in his eyes. 16, old enough to know what pain was, but too young to understand what it meant to carry the world on your shoulders." The visitor frowned. 16, that means. Bob didn't let him finish. "I didn't go looking for him. It wasn't some planned moment. It was an accident, a moment of crossing paths. Elvis wasn't surrounded by reporters or fans. It wasn't a show or a signing. It was just a quiet space, a forgotten corner, a place where he thought no one could see him." The visitor waited, knowing instinctively that the story was about to deepen. Bob took a shaky breath. He didn't know anyone was watching him. I don't think he would have wanted anyone to. His eyes drifted to the photograph again. "I saw him sitting alone, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. I remember thinking he looked like someone praying, but also someone terrified of the silence that came with prayer. The visitor's voice was cautious. What was he scared of? Bob shook his head slowly. Losing control of his life, losing his purpose, losing himself. Even then, young as he was, he understood what fame could do to a soul. He told someone once that God gave him his voice, but the world took everything else. The visitor felt a pressure build behind his ribs, like he was hearing something sacred. He looked up for just a second, Bob continued, just long enough for me to see everything he was holding inside, the fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, and something else, something like longing. Longing for what? The visitor whispered. Bob answered without hesitation. For peace. The word echoed in the quiet room. Back then, Bob said softly, I didn't understand what I was seeing. I didn't know that you could drown in your own blessings. I didn't know that being adored by millions could make you feel more alone. He paused, lost in thought. And then he said something that never left me. The visitor's breath tightened. What did he say? Bob's voice fell to a whisper. He said, I'm tired of being strong for people who don't know me. The visitor's eyes widened. Bob nodded slowly. That was the first time I heard him speak like that. The first time I realized strength can become a prison. The first time I saw the man behind the myth. He set the photograph down gently, as if setting down a fragile truth. That night shaped me more than any sermon, any scripture, any moment in church ever did, he said. It showed me that even giants fall to their knees when no one is watching. The visitor leaned forward. Is that why you became a pastor? Bob shook his head. No, I didn't choose ministry because of him, but I understood ministry because of him. The visitor paused, letting the words sink in. Bob continued, that picture there, it brought back that same expression, the same weight, the same plea for relief. The visitor glanced at the photo, then back at Bob. But Pastor, that was decades ago. Pain doesn't care about decades, Bob replied, and neither do regrets. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, softer, heavier, as if he were wrestling with an old ghost. You asked why I reacted the way I did when I saw that photo, why I froze, why I couldn't speak. The visitor nodded. Bob looked at him, not as a pastor, not as a performer, but as a man. It's because that picture shows the exact moment I should have said something to him, but didn't. The visitor blinked in confusion. Said what? Bob shook his head slowly. Back then, I didn't have the words. I didn't understand faith the way I do now. I didn't understand that some souls don't need comfort, they need truth. He took another slow breath. He needed someone to tell him he didn't owe strength to everyone. Someone to tell him he didn't need to earn peace. Someone to tell him that God doesn't demand perfection, just honesty. Bob's voice cracked slightly. But I didn't say any of that. I was 16. I stayed quiet. I just watched him walk away. The visitor felt something twist in his chest. Bob reached up and rubbed his temples, as if the memory had returned with sharper edges than he expected. When I saw that photo today, he said quietly, all I saw was that same expression, that same plea, that same man trying to carry a burden too heavy for any one person. The visitor hesitated, then asked the question sitting between them. Is that why your voice broke earlier, because you felt like you failed him? Bob didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was barely above a whisper. Part of me has always wondered if one sentence, one moment of courage might have changed something for him. He looked down at his hands. But the real reason I reacted the way I did. He lifted his eyes. He looked like he was searching for hope. The visitor swallowed, and you think you could have given it to him. Bob didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted downward, then returned slowly. I think I could have tried. Silence settled again, heavier this time, as if the truth itself needed space. After a long moment, Bob continued, "You know, I've spent years denying that I ever had any personal connection to him. People say things, they make comparisons, they build stories out of shadows. It's easier to smile and shrug it off." He glanced at the photo, the weight of years settling in his eyes. "But the truth is, he changed the way I saw people." The visitor leaned in. "How?" Bob looked him directly in the eyes. "He taught me that you can be loved by the world and still feel completely alone." The visitor sat back, absorbing the words. "And he taught me something else," Bob added softly, "something I didn't understand until I became a pastor." The visitor waited. That even the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. The visitor felt a tremor beneath his ribs. Bob continued, "People look at him and see the fame, the talent, the glory. They don't see the fear of failing the world, the guilt of not being able to save everyone around him, the loneliness that comes from knowing you can give everything and still lose yourself." His voice softened. "That picture shows the shadow, the one he never wanted the world to see." The visitor nodded slowly. "And you saw it again today?" "Yes," Bob whispered, "and it felt like God was reminding me of a moment I never finished." He looked at the visitor, voice tight with truth. "You asked what I should have said to him back then." "Yes." Bob closed his eyes. "I should have told him he didn't have to carry his life alone." He opened his eyes again, full of a quiet ache. "And when I saw that photo today, for a moment, it felt like he was still asking me the same question." The visitor felt his breath catch. "What question?" Bob looked down at the photograph once more. "With eyes like that," he whispered, "a man is asking, is there still hope for me?" He set the picture aside gently, as if the memory itself needed rest. The visitor sat in stunned silence. Bob leaned back, exhaling deeply. "And that," he said, "is why I froze." The visitor swallowed. "Because," Bob continued, his voice trembling with emotion he no longer tried to hide, "the look in his eyes that night and the look in this photo, they're the same." He paused. "The look of a man searching for something he can't name." The visitor hesitated, searching for what? The pastor's answer came quietly. "For God." Those two words hung in the air like a final echo. But the moment wasn't finished. Not yet. Because after a long, reflective silence, Bob whispered something even softer. "And I'm not sure, after all these years, if he ever found him." The visitor's breath stilled. And Bob's eyes closed, as if bracing himself for the truth he would finally reveal next. A truth he had carried for decades. A truth that would change everything the visitor thought he knew. And everything Bob kept locked inside. For a moment, Pastor Bob didn't say anything. He just sat there with that old photograph resting inches from his hand, as if the air around it had gotten heavier. The visitor didn't want to push him, but the silence had a story in it, one waiting to be pulled out gently, thread by thread. Finally, Bob exhaled, slow and shaky, like someone bracing himself to step into a memory he'd avoided for years. "You asked what he was searching for," he said quietly, "and I told you the truth. He was searching for God, but I didn't tell you how I know." The visitor nodded, then waited. Bob looked down. When he continued, his voice carried the weight of something he'd never spoken aloud. "There was a moment, one moment, when he let me see something he never showed anyone." His throat tightened around the words. "You see that look in the photo, that heaviness, that question behind the eyes?" He tapped the picture gently. "I saw that same look the night he finally asked me for help." The visitor's heartbeat thudded in his ears. Help with what? Bob's eyes softened, not with pity, but with a kind of old sorrow. With himself. Another silence, another breath. Then he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice lower. "It happened late. It always happened late with him. Nights when the house was quiet, when the laughter was gone, when the noise of the world finally gave him a moment to hear his own thoughts. He sighed. Most people don't understand solitude is terrifying when you've spent years hiding from your own heart. The visitor swallowed hard. He'd been struggling, Bob continued. You could feel it. Anyone who paid attention could feel it, but the world didn't want to see a man when they could see a legend, and legends don't get to break. His voice cracked then, just slightly. One night I found him sitting alone again, same as when I was 16, same posture, same stillness, except this time he wasn't just tired, he was scared. The visitor leaned in, scared of what? Bob's answer came without hesitation. Of losing the parts of himself he wasn't finished with. He looked down again, remembering a moment that had lived rent-free in the back of his mind for decades. He had his Bible with him, Bob said softly, but it wasn't open. It was just there, sitting beside him like something he didn't know how to touch. That detail alone twisted something deep inside the visitor. He wasn't reading it, Bob continued. He wasn't even holding it. He was just staring at it like it was a doorway he didn't know how to walk through. A micro-silence, heavy, tense. Then Bob said something that made the visitor's breath stutter. He asked me a question that night, one I've lived with ever since. He said, "Do you think God still hears me?" The visitor felt chills crawl down his spine. Bob nodded slowly. He didn't ask if God existed. He didn't ask if God loved him. He asked if God could hear him, because deep down he didn't think his voice mattered anymore. His breathing trembled. I was young. I didn't know the right thing to say. I mumbled something about faith, about prayer, about how God never turns his back. But the truth is, I could tell he didn't believe me. The visitor whispered. What did he say back? Bob's eyes closed. He said, "If God hears me, why do I feel so alone?" The room froze. That sentence wasn't just confession, it was collapse. He wasn't talking about fans or friends or family, Bob said gently. He was talking about that part of the soul where even applause can't reach. The visitor frowned, his voice low. "Pastor, why didn't he talk to someone closer to him?" Bob answered without hesitation. Because people close to him needed him strong, needed him shining, needed him to be the version of Elvis they depended on. He swallowed. But he didn't need a fan that night. He didn't need an audience. He needed a witness. A witness to what? The visitor asked softly. To his humanity. Bob leaned back, rubbing his palms together as if trying to warm hands that grew cold from memory. He told me he felt like he'd built a life that didn't belong to him, a life built on expectations he could never meet. He said, "I can sing for the world, but I can't hear my own voice anymore." The visitor felt the words sink in like stones. And then, Bob continued, he asked the question that has kept me awake more nights than I care to admit. Another micro pause. He said, "Do you think God could forgive someone like me?" The visitor's eyes widened. Why would he even ask that? Bob looked at him with a sadness that had clearly aged decades. Because he carried more guilt than anyone ever realized. Guilt over choices he made, guilt over choices he didn't make, guilt for the people he couldn't help, guilt for the people he tried to help, guilt for surviving things he thought should have broken him. His voice thinned, guilt for being human in a world that wanted him perfect. The visitor had no words. "And I didn't know what to tell him," Bob whispered. "I didn't know how to answer a man who had given himself to the world and still felt unworthy." He shook his head slowly. "So I told him the only thing I could." The visitor asked, "What was that?" "That God doesn't ask you to be perfect, just honest." Bob's voice dropped lower, and he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "I don't even know who I am anymore to be honest about." The visitor's breath caught. "That," Bob said quietly, "is the moment this photograph brought back." He nodded at the picture on the desk, the one where Elvis's eyes carried the same quiet ache. That same expression, that same heaviness, that same fear of disappearing into his own shadow. The visitor was silent. Pastor Bob continued, softer now. He didn't want fame that night. He didn't want answers. He didn't want solutions. He wanted someone to see him without the music, without the myth, without the gold or the glow. His voice cracked. He wanted someone to tell him he wasn't beyond saving. A tear slipped down Bob's cheek before he could stop it. You know, he whispered, people ask why his music reached so many souls. I think it's because he sang like someone trying to heal himself, and hoping the world might heal him in return. The visitor felt something tighten in his chest. Bob took a long breath, and then he asked the hardest question of all. The visitor didn't move. He said, Bob paused, steadying himself, if God can hear me, why can't I hear him? The air turned cold. That's the question I never answered, Bob whispered. I didn't know how. The visitor asked gently, what did you say? Bob shook his head, ashamed. I told him I didn't know, because faith was still something I was searching for myself. He rubbed his jaw, voice heavy with regret. I didn't know that silence can be the loudest cry for help. The visitor swallowed. Pastor, what happened after that? Bob stared at the floor for a long moment. He wiped his face, took a deep breath, then stood up like he had to carry the world again, and he said, forget I said any of that. The visitor felt his heart sink. Yes, Bob murmured. He turned his pain off like a switch, the same way he turned the stage lights on, 1 second vulnerable, the next armored. Another breath. He walked away before I could say anything else, and I never saw that look in his eyes again. He paused, at least not in person. The visitor looked at the photo again, suddenly seeing something he hadn't noticed before, the same quiet desperation Bob had described. And when he died, Bob continued, that night haunted me, not because I could have saved him, but because I could have answered him. He shook his head. I could have told him that the silence he heard wasn't God abandoning him, it was God waiting for him. I could have told him that the guilt he carried wasn't unforgivable, it was human. He wiped another tear. I could have told him that he had worth beyond the spotlight, and that his soul mattered more than his songs. The visitor whispered, but you didn't know then. I know that, Bob said softly, but the heart doesn't care, regret doesn't negotiate. He looked up, eyes full of memory and ache. And when I saw that photo today, it felt like Elvis was asking me that same question all over again. What question? The visitor asked. Bob touched the picture with trembling fingers. Does God still hear me? The visitor felt a knot rise in his throat. And that's why, Bob whispered, my voice broke when I saw it. A long silence. Then Bob added something even softer, something that cut straight through the air between them. He wasn't looking at a camera when this picture was taken, he said. He was looking for hope. The visitor leaned in with a hushed breath. Pastor, what did you see in his eyes that day? Bob looked down at the photograph one last time. Redemption, he whispered, but also fear. Another pause. And maybe a plea I didn't answer. The visitor swallowed hard. And now, Bob said gently, you understand why that picture hit me like it did. He closed his eyes. And why there's still one more part of the story you need to hear. The visitor leaned forward, pulse rising. What part? He asked. Bob opened his eyes slowly, eyes full of something final, something raw, something that had waited decades to be spoken. The part, he said quietly, that explains exactly what he was asking God for that night. A breath. And why I didn't realize it until after he was gone. The visitor didn't breathe. Bob lowered his voice. And it's the part I've never told anyone. He didn't speak for a long time after saying those last words. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's holding something alive inside it, something delicate, something painful, something waiting for permission to come out. The visitor didn't interrupt. He could feel the gravity of what was coming. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was reverence. Finally, Pastor Bob breathed out slow and uneven, the way a man does when he's about to open a door he's kept locked for decades. "You want to know what he asked God for?" he said quietly. "The thing I didn't understand until after he passed." The visitor nodded, barely breathing. Bob didn't lift his eyes right away. His fingers traced the corner of the photograph as if he needed the touch of it to steady himself. When he finally spoke, the words came soft, like a confession no one had earned but everyone needed. "He asked for rest." The visitor blinked. "Rest." Bob nodded. "Not sleep, not a break, not a vacation, rest, the kind only peace can give." He swallowed, eyes tightening at the memory. That night when he asked me if God could hear him, he wasn't doubting faith. He was doubting whether he had anything left to give. Another breath. He felt emptied, drained, like he was pouring from a cup that had run dry years earlier. The visitor's chest tightened. "He looked at me with this expression I'll never forget," Bob murmured. Like he'd carried a weight for so long, he didn't know where the man ended and the burden began. He paused, searching for the right words. He said, "I don't know how to stop running." The visitor whispered, "Running from what?" Bob looked up then, eyes shadowed. From himself, from the pain, from expectations, from guilt, from the noise of the world and the silence of his own heart. A breath. And from the fear that if he ever stopped, the whole world would collapse. The visitor felt something cold slip down his spine. "And the worst part," Bob added softly, "he honestly believed that he didn't deserve rest. He thought he had to earn it, thought he had to fix himself first, thought he had to become someone God would want to listen to." Bob's eyes glistened. "No one ever told him that rest isn't something you earn, it's something you receive." The visitor felt a lump forming at the back of his throat. "I didn't know how to say that to him back then," Bob whispered. "I didn't understand that the very thing he was begging for was the one thing grace could have given him freely." He shook his head slowly. "It took me years, years in ministry, years studying scripture, years helping people through their own pain to finally understand what he was asking that night. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for answers. He wasn't even asking for strength." Another breath. He was asking for permission to stop pretending. The words hit the visitor like a blow he didn't expect. "People talk about his music," Bob continued, "his voice, his presence, his fame, but they don't talk about the exhaustion that comes from being everything to everyone." He tapped the photo gently. "And that exhaustion is in his eyes here, the longing, the ache, the plea." Another silence. "Does God still hear me?" wasn't really the question. The real question was, is there still a place for me where I don't have to be Elvis Presley? The visitor's breath trembled. "And that," Bob whispered, "is the part of the story nobody ever asked about, nobody wanted to know, nobody looked for." He leaned back, shoulders heavy with memory. "When he died, the world mourned the legend, the icon, the king. But I mourned the man who sat in the quiet asking if he was allowed to be tired." A long pause. "And the night I heard he was gone," Bob said, voice barely holding, "the first thing I thought was, did God finally give him the rest he was searching for?" The visitor felt his eyes sting. "He wasn't asking for a miracle," Bob continued. "He wasn't asking to be saved from fame or illness or pressure. He was asking for a soft landing, a quiet place, a moment where he could put the weight down without the world calling his name." Bob nodded slowly. "And that's why the picture broke me today, because that look, that same wounded, searching look, it reminded me of the moment he almost asked for help, the moment he almost said the words he needed to say, and the moment I failed to hear the ache beneath them." He closed his eyes briefly. "I was too young to understand, too inexperienced, too unsure," and he walked away thinking he had to carry that pain alone. The visitor whispered, "But Pastor, you couldn't have known." Bob nodded. "I know that now, but the heart doesn't heal with logic. it heals with closure, and closure is something I never got. He ran a tired hand over his face. And then people started saying I looked like him, sang like him, stood like him, and every time someone said it, I felt that night all over again, felt the guilt, felt the question, felt the prayer I never answered. The visitor stared at the old photograph, suddenly seeing it differently. It wasn't resemblance that shook me today, Bob said softly, it was recognition. In what way? The visitor asked. Bob pointed gently at Elvis's eyes. In that picture, he wasn't a star, he wasn't a performer, he wasn't a symbol. He was a man on the edge of surrender, a man who wanted to stop holding the world together just long enough to breathe. His voice deepened with emotion, and I realized that the pain he carried then is why I became who I am now. The visitor blinked. You mean becoming a pastor? Bob nodded. I became someone who could say the words I didn't know how to say to him, someone who could tell broken people that God hears them even when they hear nothing back, someone who could speak the truth he needed to every soul who walks in lost, someone who could give others the peace he wanted so desperately. A shaky breath. He asked for rest, and I spend my life trying to give rest to others because I couldn't give it to him. The visitor felt his heart twist painfully. And that, Bob said quietly, is the truth I never told anyone, not because I was hiding it, but because I wasn't ready to say it out loud. He looked up slowly. And when you placed this picture on my desk today, it felt like God was asking me a question I had avoided for years. The visitor leaned in. What question? Bob's voice softened to almost nothing. Have you forgiven yourself? The visitor closed his eyes. Bob exhaled. And I'm still learning how to. He gently set the photograph aside. You see, he whispered, people think this is about whether I'm him, whether there's a resemblance, whether there's a connection, but the truth is simpler and heavier. He folded his hands. I'm not trying to be Elvis Presley. I'm trying to be the man he wished he could talk to again. The visitor felt tears burn the back of his eyes. And every time someone comes to me looking for hope, I think of him, of that night, of his question, and I answer them the way I wish I'd answered him. Bob's voice steadied, soft but strong. He wasn't looking for fame, he wasn't looking for miracles, he wasn't looking for redemption, he was looking for permission to rest. A long stillness washed through the room. I pray, Bob whispered, that he found it. The visitor swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the story settle deep in his chest. Bob leaned back, eyes softening with something like peace. And that, he murmured, is why his picture still breaks me. Another silence. Then he added something so quiet, the visitor barely caught it. It reminds me of the question I never got to answer, and the man I wish I could have helped. The visitor didn't speak. He knew the moment didn't need words. And Pastor Bob, after a long breath, finally closed his eyes, not in pain this time, but in a quiet surrender of his own. A surrender to memory. A surrender to truth. A surrender to forgiveness he was learning to give himself. And somewhere in the quiet, the old photograph stayed on the desk, its eyes holding a story that finally, after decades of silence, had been spoken aloud. There are moments in a life that don't vanish when time moves on. They echo. They sit quietly inside us, waiting for the day we finally turn around and face them. Pastor Bob carried one of those moments for decades, a single night when a tired, world-worn man asked a question that sounded like doubt, but was really a plea for peace. A question Bob never understood until the world no longer had the chance to hear the answer. If this story reached you, it's because some truths outlive the men who speak them, and some prayers, even whispered in fear, don't fade. They find their way into memory, into healing, into the hearts willing to listen. Stay with us. There are more untold stories still quietly waiting in the shadows of Elvis's legacy.